Malcolm X is a very powerful film. It's a very long film, I guess a very comprehensive film, but I'd say it's worth watching. This was released in 1992. It's directed by Spike Lee. It's written by Lee and Arnold Pearl, and we have a cast including Denzel Washington as Malcolm X. We also have Angela Bassett, Delroy Lindo, we have Spike Lee, and Peter Boyle. He plays an NYPD officer, and it's because of Peter Boyle that I was going to say that I became aware of this film. I don't necessarily think that's true. I was already aware of the film, but certainly it put the film on my radar. It's not something I'd ever really considered watching, largely because of the length. It is over 3 hours, and I'll be honest, I feel like no feature film has business being that long. If you want to create something that long, make it a TV series, a mini-series. I don't think it's an acceptable length for a feature film. And I will stand by that. It doesn't matter how good the film is, that's far too long. And I will say there were bits in this that probably could have been removed and we wouldn't have lost anything, but I don't necessarily think it was padded. I don't think the story was stretched out too much. And I'll talk more about the narrative in a moment, of course, but I do think it would have been better as a mini-series. Largely for my attention span, but I also think maybe if it was a mini-series it could have been a little longer and they could have done even more with it because there is a lot of substance there. It is a biographical epic of Malcolm X's life, and I know, or knew I guess, I'd say the basics of Malcolm X. I studied Malcolm X at school a little bit, but I probably didn't retain a lot of what I learned. So I'd say I had a pretty average knowledge of Malcolm X and his activism and a lot of the difficulties that he faced. And that was something that gave me a very basic foundation for watching this. If you start watching this with no idea of who Malcolm X is, I think you'd still be able to follow it. I don't really think you need that much background information. You need to know basically that he's an African-American activist, and this takes place up to and around the 60s, and it's a difficult watch, not just because of the length, but obviously a lot of the treatments of Malcolm X and other individuals, a lot of the attitudes. It's very difficult to watch, but in a way, that's a good thing. If it was easy to watch some of these treatments, I think that in itself would be a problem. So I do think it's a very powerful film. I don't want to go into too much detail about the specifics that happen, of course, partly because either you already know about Malcolm X or you don't, and I think this could be a good introduction. But I will say that some of the behaviours of some of the characters are just utterly disgusting and so difficult to watch. And there are some genuinely scary scenes that happen to Malcolm X, to other characters, unforgivable treatments, and Malcolm X comes across in, and again, I am not an expert on him in any way, but he comes across in this as being knowledgeable, strong, determined, passionate, powerful, internally powerful, and the character, at least the way the character is written, is really compelling, really fascinating. I think Denzel Washington gave a great performance. Again, I don't know how accurate it is to the true character, but I'm going to assume it's pretty accurate. And in terms of the technical aspects, the camera work's fine, the music's fine. Visually, it's definitely a very effective film, and the other characters, well written, interesting. It is engaging. It is long. It's way too long for me to sit in one sitting. I did watch this in 2 sittings, and within the same day, but still, my attention span doesn't last that long. And despite that, it is engaging. There are very few moments where I found it to be slow, as I said before, like they were padding it or anything. There's not really a lot there. And that's why I think partly it might have been better as a miniseries. Maybe they could have even done, and I'm just guessing here, but they could have done 5 1-hour episodes to make a solid miniseries. And I think there would have been enough material for that. And I think it would have been a much more comprehensive experience. But that being said, this is still very comprehensive. There is a lot going on. It's a very busy film. I think from my, amateur perspective, it details Malcolm X's life very effectively. If anybody knows of any inaccuracies or creative liberties, please feel free to let me know. But from my perspective, it seemed to do the job. It seemed to deliver things well, and with some really powerful emotional performances as well. It has 7.7 out of 10 on IMDb and a Metascore of 73. That IMDb scores across 107,000 reviews and ratings. It was nominated for 2 Oscars. Let me see what the Oscar nominations were for. Best Actor for Denzel Washington, of course. And Best Costume Design. Costumes by Ruth E. Carter. And yeah, the costumes look great. I'm not an expert on costumes from that time period, so I can't say they're accurate, but I'm assuming they are. And yeah, it feels atmospheric. It feels like I've been transported back in time, which really helps to make the quite scary, frightening scenes even darker and more difficult to watch, but in a way that's very effective. So aside from the length, I don't really have any complaints. But as I said, I feel like there's enough substance there that the length is kind of warranted, but that also makes me think it might have been better as a miniseries. But if you've got the attention span for it, or if you don't mind watching it in 2 parts, then I'd say Malcolm X is worth checking out. I'm also willing to admit I probably didn't absorb absolutely everything in this. It is a very busy, very full film, and that's absolutely not a criticism. That is absolutely a compliment to the film. And I feel like if I ever wanted to look into Malcolm X's life in more detail, I'd be quite happy to watch this again. And if anybody can recommend any other sources, please feel free to do so. And for now, I'm happy to recommend the 1992 film Malcolm X.